Hello everyone and welcome to this week's edition of The Verdict. First week in August, caught really between Goodwood and York, and as a result it's a fairly eclectic mix that we have for you during the course of the next half an hour or so, covering 6 races. And that's an example for the first race really, because it's an unusual type contest. €300,000 for a median auction sales race that was the Ballyhane Stakes. Now, as always the case with these sorts of races, they attract horses of varying degrees of ability. Just explain the median auction bit to start off with. The median auction value of the sire had to be 75,000 or less. So if you had 3 horses that had gone through the ring by a sire and they'd gone for 30,000, 40,000 or 80,000, you don't add them up and divide by 3. You take the middle value, so the second value, 40,000, determining the sire. And that brings in quite a few actually. 75,000 is quite high. Sacred Bridge arrived here as favourite and was well backed, 5-2 into 15-8, unbeaten in 2 starts and already successful in a listed race at Tipperary. Ever Given, a slight drifter, 11-4 out to 7-2, and Bosch at 4-1 was third best in the market. Ever Given backing up quickly, having run just a couple of days earlier at Goodwood. So let's check out the way the race evolves. There's a lot of them, and what I want to draw attention to first of all is where the first 3 come from, because the group that are on the left hand side, the high numbers, make a better fist of all staying together, which makes it easier for that whole group. And you can see stalls 1, 2 and 3 coming out from stalls 20, 19 and 18, and splitting the difference there in 17 is the 4th placed horse as well. So we've got that little bunch which are going to come out on top. What's the reason for that? Well, partly they're better horses, but also immediately we break away from the stalls. Just look at how the group on the left-hand side cluster together. The group in the middle, they don't do a bad job, at least early on. There's less of them, but the group on the right really are making it very hard for themselves. They fragmented right across the course, and even though one of the outsiders tows the whole field along briefly, that's Jarvis on the right in white and blue, it's up the centre of the racecourse, Hadman, who begins to make some progress, and soon that horse with the white face right up the centre is very prominent as well. Now at this stage the group towards the left are furthest back. I don't think it was anything massively tempo related that sees them come through. I just think they were able to get cover, able to get a nice toe into the race, and it developed more evenly for them. So towards the business end, Hadman with the white face and Smullen with the white sheepskin noseband have taken over in the centre. First the big guns to play the card is Ever Given, who just drifts to the left, which doesn't really help him. And the 2 that fight out the finish, Sacred Bridge and Bosch, along with the outsider Ultramarine, begin their challenges towards the near side. And eventually it is Sacred Bridge that maintains that unbeaten record, Bosch finishing half a length in 2nd place. So what do we take from this particular race? I think Hadman is a horse to be very interested in. The pale blue colours with the white face. A couple of reasons. One, we've already mentioned, raced a little bit isolated and probably went hard enough in the middle stages of the race. Was just about flat out from an early stage. Alongside that horse is a horse called Smullen in the white sheepskin noseband of Kevin Ryan's, and I would upgrade both of those. I don't think they got the benefit of racing as tightly in that near side group, and you can see that Sacred Bridge comes through to land the spoils. From the head on, let's concentrate on the group on the left hand side, which is after all where the winners come from. Nice run by Ultramarine, but he has been beaten plenty of times already, and so third 50-1 is always slightly concerning whether they'll back that up. Sacred Bridge and Bosch, they're highly likely to make their mark in Pattern Company. Often these valuable sales races, as we saw in this country with the Tattersalls races, encourage trainers who have the luxury of their horses fitting the bill, in this case being by bated breath and profitable, of actually getting a big pot without having to dip their toe into group company. So what do we take from the race? Well, first of all, the point I've already mentioned, I think the first thing you can say is that the first 2, Sacred Bridge and Bosch, they're highly likely to make their marks in Pattern Company. I think Bosch might turn out to be more of a 7-furlong horse. Sacred Bridge, not quite so bothered, and Joe Lyons said that it was highly likely that Sacred Bridge would be in Pattern races next time out. As regards to the second thing, well, I believe you should upgrade those horses towards the centre, particularly Smullen and Hadman, and they are 2 horses that we can be interested in, not in Pattern Company, but they both hold entries in similar sales races. Smullen's is at York, and Kevin Ryan has a good record in those sorts of contests, and Hadman, who I think is the most interesting horse of all, is in a Doncaster sales race. Horse holds group entries as well, but I'm not as convinced that quite up to that class. But I think Hadman is not one to discount. Had finished third in a Group 3 prior to that, and if turning up at Doncaster in that sales race in a month's time could be interesting. And the final point is that even though this is a sort of median auction race with conditions that might encourage lower sires to get involved in their progeny, in actual fact the first two runnings have gone to Coolmore and Juddmonte, and that's because 75,000 is quite high for a median auction prize. So it's wrong to think that this is a sort of fairy tale race, a race like the Newbury Super Sprint. So it was the second running of that race, a consolation race filled as well, so I think we can say that it has been a success. First two for Patten Company, and Hadman maybe one to keep an eye on at a slightly lower level, maybe in that Doncaster sales race. Now going to move on to Leopardstown on Thursday. One of the most eagerly awaited appearances of recent weeks was that of Tarnawa, who lined up as a short price favourite in the 1.5 mile Ballyhane Stakes. Sent off at 1-2, Benno and Taipan were next in the market at 6-1 and 13-2 for Silence Please. Just before we get into the race itself, there are a couple of instances that were pre-race that are worth drawing your attention to. First of all, Tarnawa parted company with the rider, Colin Keane, but we think it might have been caused by this horse here, Taipan, who kicks the running rail. Now you'll see Tarnawa minus the rider on the left-hand side. If we show this from a different angle, you'll see that Tarnawa appears to get spooked by the rail being kicked down. Now that rail was kicked down by the horse behind, and it was a soft sort of sideways dismount from Colin Keane. But if you're taking such a short price favourite, you don't really want all of these incidents. And we also had Tarnawa just proving awkward at the stalls. This was probably more concerning because obviously the blanket is there, own handler, etc. And eventually they decided to load Tarnawa minus the rider. Now you can do this in foreign jurisdictions, so she's not going to have a problem if she requires similar in the Arc. But it is just a slight concern going forward whether those sort of little things become bigger things when she's up in grade. So here we go, 1, 2 and 3. To be honest, once we run this race, it is really all about Tarnawa. She had £20 in hand. Her late reappearance this year had meant that she didn't even get a penalty for those trio of Grade 1 successes that she had towards the back end, the Group 1s, the Vermeer and the Prix de l'Opera, where she ran on rather than going for the Arc, and then of course that impressive performance in the Breeders' Cup Fillies and Mares. She settles in 6th or 7th place. She's in those Aga Khan colours of green and red. Key horse in many ways for this contest turned out to be Taipan, who kicked the rail down beforehand, purple and green colours on the inside, because any worries about this not being a real test and Tarnawa being caught back in the field for a dash are quickly dispelled here as Taipan moves on. All of the other horses in this race are sort of Group 3 listed standard. No more than that. She didn't really face a rival of any significance, so it was more how Tarnawa was going to move through the race. Colin Keane begins, mindful of Taipan beginning to increase the tempo, moves forward. There is only one flat spot during the course of this race, and it is again when those inferior horses just try to stretch on. It counts against them in the end because Tarnawa can not only cover the move, but they have expended a fair bit of petrol in trying to break away. That's certainly the case for Taipan, who is basically, once he compounds, is going to fade pretty quickly. Tarnawa at this stage just moved a little bit closer onto the heels of Benno. Some of the bit players just beginning to drop away. When the camera angle changes, you'll get a better idea of Tarnawa just briefly being pushed along. It doesn't last very long, but of course it could be more significant in a stronger renewal of races. That's the moment here. We can see that camera angle changes and Colin Keane just briefly asks the horse to close. But once she gets on the outside of Benno and eventually switches back to the inner, then she picks up quickly and in quite taking fashion, as you would expect. So once she's moved to the inside of Benno there, that's the point where she's shaken up and asked to improve. And quickly it becomes clear that she is travelling far, far better than those around who are now beginning to feel the pinch. What do we make of the return? Well, it's satisfactory. She's likely to have a busy autumn campaign, campaigned internationally, likely to head for the Irish Champion Stakes over 10 furlongs and the Arc over 1.5 miles in her next two runs, and then potentially the likes of the Japan Cup, maybe the Breeders' Cup. This is the most impressive fact, as Silence Please, who has finished runner-up in a similar contest in the past, is readily left behind. Taipan's got very weary, but Tarnawa is effectively doing no more than you might have expected of her in landing the spoils in very, very comfortable fashion. So What do you make of that? Well, satisfactory to encouraging return. She showed she retains her ability, which is clearly going to be important, but it'd be wrong to overface what she actually achieved. So she outclassed her rivals on her first run back. A potentially busy international autumn campaign, as we mentioned, and that could revolve next time around the Irish Champion Stakes. The drop back to 10 furlongs will be interesting. Come on to that in a moment. The second point is just keep an eye on her pre-race behaviour. I'd be slightly more worried about the stalls than I would about that unshipping, which we think was probably due to Taipan. The third point, last year she was very versatile between 10 and 12 furlongs, and that will be put to the test quite early if she goes for the Irish Champion Stakes over 10. Just that brief flat spot and how strong she was at the finish makes me feel that a mile and a half might see her to best effect this year. But all in all, it was really good to see one of the leading horses of last year return in comfortable fashion and setting up some tougher targets ahead. And some of the clashes that she will be involved in are likely to be mouth-watering between now and the end of the season. Now we're going to move on to the first of three races we're going to focus on Saturday. One of the major domestic races of the week was the Sweet Solera, a race for 7 furlongs for fillies at Newmarket. Betting was headed by Wild Beauty at 5-2. Value Theory and Majestic Glory, who both had course experience, were second in at 3-1 and 5-1 respectively. Art Bracken 6-1 and Sunstrike, who had form with Wild Beauty, 13-2. Should have been more at 8s and then 4 big priced outsiders, none of whom actually really got too involved. So once again, let's set up the race from the stalls, and once again let's highlight where the first 4 come from. And there's no great pattern to this. The draws for those horses were 11, 5, 9 and 2, so you can see right across the board. Worth just pointing out that with the stalls positioned over on that far side, it is the high numbers that are closer to the running rail. That always isn't the most obvious thing these days. Normally the low numbers closer to the rails, but where on the Newmarket, their far side, then stall 11 is where the winner comes from. From the stalls, a couple of them are slow away, and they are amongst the outsiders. In the early stages, it is the lime green colours of Value Theory who takes them along. But I think any chance that Franny Norton had of getting a soft lead is slightly taken away by the fact that Value Theory doesn't really drop her head here. You can see she's just doing a little bit more, and Franny's really having to grab hold. It did look at this stage as if it might be quite a steadily run race, but I do think that's deceptive, and having watched it a couple of times, a couple of those towards the back should have been more in the red cap, for example, and Sunstrike in the claret colours. They're the ones from furthest back, but at this stage should have been more is actually already being pushed along. I think it's highly likely that it was just the best horses rather than any massive pace advantage that played out in this contest. And with Value Theory doing a bit much, it was Wild Beauty in the blue colours of Godolphin and the noseband of Majestic Glory, who was just a little fortunate that at this point in proceedings, Renaissance, the outsider, just dropped out there. And from now on, it's pretty much a fair fight between those three towards the line. Sunstrike back in the field has to change course. Should have been more is beginning to make a little bit of ground, but beginning to look as if she already needs further. Business end of the race, Majestic Glory has claimed Value Theory, who's done her running. And even though Wild Beauty really puts her head down, I really like the way she stretches out there. She looks very keen. She's making no inroads into Majestic Glory's margin of victory come the line, which eventually was a length with a length and a quarter back to Value Theory. That's where Majestic Glory just had to move out, gave Renaissance a slight nudge. But I think most of the front three there are without any obvious excuses, and to some extent that's the same back in the field. Sunstrike finishing behind Wild Beauty as she had done in the past. They both play a little bit of a compliment to Inspiral, who beat Wild Beauty pretty well. What about Majestic Glory's credentials herself? Well, I think she's backed up pretty quickly from her last run, and she clearly is improving. Something like the Rockfell maybe could be somewhere to go, but as being a Group 3, she would avoid a penalty were she to step up in grade. Down the outside, Wild Beauty is still a horse I really like. She might be limited, but there might be options for her, which I'll come on to in a moment when we do the points to take from the race. Value Theory may be just better getting a lead from something if that helps her settle, because she's run herself out by the time she gets to the end here. But Majestic Glory it is who comes out on top. So once again, what do we take away from this race? Well, first of all, I want to highlight how well Andrew Balding's 2-year-olds have done this year. That was win number 19 from only 85 runners. At 60% more than you would have expected based on their prices, based on the prices they've been sent off. You'd expect just over 12 and a half of those to have won. The fact that 19 have shows just what a good season Andrew's having and how the performance of his horses amongst the juvenile division continue to be underestimated in the market. Also, going on is a side battle this time around between Frankel and Galileo. And if we move on to that, this is to be leading sire. A 1-2 for Frankel helps him extend his lead over Galileo in the battle to be leading sire. If you take all of Europe into account, Alpinista's 90 grand as well on Sunday means that Frankel still holds round about 300,000 to 400,000 advantage over Galileo. It's a fascinating clash. The late Galileo has been champion sire on many occasions, but Frankel is laying down the claim to take over that mantle this season. And finally, the third point is specific to Wild Beauty, because if you look at Wild Beauty's pedigree, it's actually related to a horse that did okay on dirt, and it wouldn't be beyond the bounds of possibility that Wild Beauty could do well at the Dubai World Cup Carnival. If she'll handle dirt okay, she seems to have the right sort of run style. She could be the type for the likes of the UAE 1000 Guineas. I'm not sure whether that's where they will send her, but there are a small group of races there where you don't have a great horse population where she could do pretty well. So well done to Majestic Glory. I think it's more compliments to other horses they finished around, particularly in Spiral, rather than suggesting that this is a vintage renewal. Maybe the rock fell for a few of these next time. But nonetheless, it was a compelling performance by Majestic Glory and another example of what a fine season Andrew Balding's 2-year-olds are having. Andrew Balding was also represented in the Mansion Bet Rose of Lancaster Stakes Group 3 contest at Haydock with Fox's Tails, who eventually was a short price favourite. Should point out, however, there were significant absentees caused by the amount of rain that fell during the course of the day and was, of course, to lead to Haydock being abandoned the following day as well. Real World was the most important of those absentees, would almost certainly have gone off a shortish priced favourite. So these were the 6 that remained. Fox's Tails 5-4. You Can Glen, who's proved such a wonderful old horse, at 5-2, 15-2 for Fancy Man and Stormy Antarctic, Extra Elusive 11-1, previous winner, and Majestic Dawn at 14s. Right, let's take the race from the stalls, and again we'll highlight those horses that are involved in the finish, but this is nothing to do with the draw, it's just to ident the horses. They're all side by side, but as you'll see, they split into 2 little groups early on, and neither group appears to be favoured. So let's take a look at how this race unfolded. Conditions clearly were already taking their toll, and from the stalls, it's a pretty quiet beginning. Majestic Dawn leads 3 horses, which includes Extra Elusive and Fancy Man, initially towards the far side. Fox's Tails, blue colours with the noseband. Stormy Antarctic has the white face, and last of all was You Can Glen, which is the usual run style. You can see just how attritional conditions were, and they moved just to cut the corner off before tacking over to the near side rail. The thing I want to draw your attention to in the run is how the second horse, Fancy Man, travels much better than Fox's Tails, and we'll pick that up in a moment. When conditions are like this, they rarely go too hard, particularly amongst older horses, and I think a handy position was certainly useful. Extra Elusive is to drop out. Stormy Antarctic and You Can Glen never really get involved, and the little group that are now closest to the running rail are the 3 that maintain that positions towards the finish. Majestic Dawn ran well for Paul and Oliver Cole, whose horses are running well at the moment. Extra Elusive, a rare below par effort from a horse that has been rejuvenated by the association with Holly Doyle, but on this occasion Extra Elusive just didn't really have a going day. This is where Fox's Tails begins to come off the bridle, and it's quite a prolonged period as well, where it looks as if Silvestre de Souza is struggling, particularly in comparison to Fancy Man. Extra Elusive comes to the near side. It seems to backfire because eventually drops out to finish last. You Can Glen and Stormy Antarctic never really get involved, but around about this point, just look how much better Fancy Man in the striped colours is travelling than the horse in the noseband, Fox's Tails, and I think it's a little bit of a surprise in a way that Fancy Man doesn't go on to win, or perhaps how much Fox's Tails responds to Silvestre's urgings and picks up well. This is where Majestic Dawn gets challenged, initially by Fancy Man, but pretty swiftly by Fox's Tails as well. Fancy Man just seems to hang fire slightly, just shifting out to the right. Proven on the ground, so that shouldn't really be the reason. And Fox's Tails gets a little bit of a head of steam, albeit taking a while to roll up, And it's only when Fox's Tails goes to the front that Fancy Man, having not got anywhere for a furlong or so, seems to consent to chase, which is slightly concerning. It's closing down at the finish because the main concern is whether or not Fancy Man actually wants to go by, however well he's travelling. But he has a horse we haven't really seen the best of, I think, in his recent starts. At Chester, he went a little bit too early. He then backed up quickly in the Fairway Stakes behind John Leaper and Tasman Bay, form that actually, from Tasman Bay's point of view, has worked out quite well. So, once again, what are the takeaways from this particular contest? Well, let's concentrate on the winner first of all. The Newmarket Handicap, in which Fox's Tails finished second, looks strong form. It's already thrown up another winner down the field in Headingley. It was won by Dubai Honour. King of Clubs was third. They were horses that appeared to be on a roll. And it was also a successful transition to group company for Fox's Tails, although he did seem to make quite hard work of it. Again, a theme we've seen quite a lot during the course of the season are 1-2 for 3-year-olds. The 3-year-olds have acquitted themselves really well when they've met the older horses, and whilst Fox's Tails was towards the top of the market, Fancy Man was only just shading third favouritism ahead of Stormy Antarctic, and I think as a result, once again, it's worth making that point. Fancy Man is either going to be a cliff horse or he has a bigger performance in him. I'm still just about in his camp because I can see him getting the conditions that suit him, soft ground, for example, between now and the end of the season. And something like the Darley at Newmarket late in the season could be ideal for him. Maybe go to France, where his ability to travel in steadily run races would be good. Just in the back of my mind now, seeing him run on again late is a question as to whether or not he will be a cliff horse. We will wait and see. But certainly, I think on the way he travelled, Fancy Man is worth one more chance. But Andrew Balding, big race double, Fox's Tails, responding well to pressure. Remember that if he comes off the bridle in future runs. Fifth race, and we're going back to Ireland, remaining on Saturday for the Give Thanks Stakes, a race that had been won by Tarnawa last year. This year, La Petite Coco headed the market at 2-1, ahead of Thunder Kiss at 11-4 and Willow at 4-1. So this contest, 1.5 miles, was run on soft ground, and we're going to show you the race in full. And it featured an impressive performance by the winner in La Petite Coco. Eventually, he's going to pull 5.5 lengths clear of Thunder Kiss. Now, Thunder Kiss had beaten the horse that finished second to Tarnawa. So pretty similar levels of race for the majority of those participants. But at the end, La Petite Coco stamped herself well above them. You can see in the early stages the pace is just an even one, being cut out by High Heels for Aidan O'Brien and Wayne Lawden, and quickly attended by Yaxini, who also raced in a handy position. Both of those are going to drop out. The winner is the horse in green and red, the Team Valour colours, racing on the outside of the grey Thunder Kiss, and they are going to field the first two home. Federica Sophia on the outside with the noseband runs a little bit wide in the early stages. In order to understand the worth of this, it's worth pointing out the official ratings of a few of those that La Petite Coco ends up beating. Thunder Kiss is rated 105, Federica Sophia 100, and Amma Grace 107. Weight for age is obviously in La Petite Coco's benefit in terms of the weight carried, and Thunder Kiss carried a penalty for that victory we mentioned a couple of starts ago. For the majority of this race, it looks a little bit like a run-of-the-mill Group 3. But in the closing stages, that changed markedly. And the difficulty is to try and work out exactly what La Petite Coco, who was stepping up to 1.5 miles for the first time, actually achieved in leaving behind some 100-plus rated horses so readily. A little bit of impetus provided by High Heels in the middle stages of the race. But once again, I didn't think there was any great tempo bias. The main body of the field has largely ignored the leader, who comes back to them pretty swiftly and is readily dispensed with. La Petite Coco alongside Thunder Kiss, they're travelling well within themselves. Good run by Federica Sophia, because you can see here on the bend, black with the white sleeves, sheepskin noseband, has been 3 wide the entire trip, so has certainly covered a little bit of extra ground. This is where the leaders just behind the leader of the main pack sort of begin to get themselves into position to challenge, as the overall leader, High Heels, just begins to get those high heels stuck in the mud. And this is where La Petite Coco and Thunder Kiss both line up with Federica Sophia. But it's what happens now that is so impressive. We're well grouped. You're probably still, with outside the leader, 4 or 5 horses that have got a chance here. But this is what La Petite Coco does in the final 2 furlongs. Finishes off very rapidly, and puts a good deal of distance between herself and her rivals. Trained by Paddy Toomey, Billy Lee in the saddle. And again, just when you think, oh, well, she might get to the end of her tether, she seems to pick up again. I'm slightly suspicious in going overboard about this, but leaving 3 horses, just a reminder, that are all rated 100 plus, 105 and 107 in some of those cases, means that that, in theory, would attract a very high rating. Now, Team Valour is likely to give an international profile, I think, with the likes of the EP Taylor being mentioned, or maybe the Tarnawa route by going for the Prix Vermeil. So what do we make of the performances of Le Petit Coco? She beat, as I say, 3 100-plus rivals by 5.5 lengths. That's going to give her a sort of handicap rating, or a handicap figure, rating figure, that's very high. Whether she justifies that or not will remain to be seen. The second point is the step up to 1.5 miles really seemed to suit. She was very, very strong at the finish. Her final sectionals for those final 3 furlongs are far, far better than anything else in the entire field. And the winner could follow the Tarnawa path. The Prix Vermeil, so also the EP Taylor being mentioned, and it'll be interesting to see whether the L'Opera, or probably something a little bit over more ground, is also on their calculations. Wanted to bring you that because it's a race that was quite eye-catching in terms of what La Petite Coco achieved. She put into bed pretty fast. She'll get a lofty rating. Time will tell whether she justifies it fully. And so on to the highlight of Sunday. Group 1, the Keeneland Phoenix Stakes, the first Group 1 race for the juveniles, be followed by the Mornay, and then, of course, the likes of the Middle Park and the Cheveley Park. This was the lineup, featuring several that had featured in that Railway Stakes finish, where Go Bears Go had beaten the likes of Dr. Zempf and Castle Star, and they filled the front 3 positions in the market. Prettiest at 10 to 1, Ebro River at 12s, 20 to 1 Twilight Jet, who was also involved in that race, as was the Entertainer and Strapped as well. So virtually a complete renewal. But there were a couple of interlopers, and it was one of those interlopers that was going to land the spoils. It was Ebro River winning the race for Hugo Palmer. Once they jumped away, the key tactical manoeuvre was Ebro River and Shane Foley, for me, coming over to the near side running rail. Racing against a rail is a plus for juveniles at the best of times, but it could be more than that for Ebro River, because he'd hung violently to the left at Sandown once getting to the front, and as a consequence this looked a sound tactical manoeuvre, and as a result he is rather hemmed in. The Entertainers on the outside, Go Bears Go, the market leader, in the purple colours, and Dr. Zempf in the two-tone green, along with Twilight Jet, all represented that Railway Stakes form. And keep an eye on Castle Star, who's right at the back in the orange colours with the white chevron, makes steady progress for Chris Hayes. One of the features of the meeting at the Curragh was a strong tailwind made it hard to make ground, so you might upgrade Castle Star marginally for that. This is where Ebro River, you can see he's looking to cast his head to one side, but Dr. Zempf is stopping him going to the right. Here he looks vulnerable, particularly with Go Bears Go and Castle Star, all involved in that Railway Stakes form. But it's Ebro River that pulls out a little bit more on the run to the line, keeps nice and straight, and is just extending that advantage close to the finish. So what do we make of this particular contest? I think we really upgrade the rider Shane Foley. I think it was a really good opportunistic effort here. Hugo Palmer, they deserve a lot of credit for a horse that had already run 7 times, I think, by the time we got to this particular contest. This was his 7th run, and he'd been beaten 3 times in Group 2 company. The Railway Stakes form well represented towards the left-hand side, but they weren't capable of going on again. Punch of the air by Shane Foley, who, as I said, flown back overnight from riding at Saratoga, and Hugo Palmer absolutely delighted that a son of a first-season sire, Galileo Gold, should win that particular contest. Galileo Gold stands for just €5,000 at the Tally-Ho stud. So full marks to connections there. So what do we make of this particular performance of Ebro River? Well, I point out it was the 7th run of his campaign. He'd been beaten in 3 previous Group 2 contests. That's not to denigrate what he achieved, but I do feel there was a little bit of opportunism on the day that was seized by Shane Foley. Good game plan for Hugo Palmer. It might be harder for him carrying penalties in Group 2s and Group 1s to come. The rail on the left-hand side and the tailwind may both have assisted the winner. Certainly he got an astute tactical ride. And again, we should point out that it's the biggest success so far for the first season sire, Galileo Gold, who, as I mentioned, doesn't stand for a great deal. Hugo Palmer, of course, trained him to win Guineas and the St James's Palace Stakes as well, so I'm sure he would have taken great pride. Of the others, I think they are just Group 2 level. I think the Railway Stakes shows that, and I'd be surprised if they went to the National. They hold various entries. A lot of them are in the Gimcrack, which would be a possibility. Go Bears Go, possibility that one holds an entry in the Mill Reef, which potentially would be a good stepping stone. David Lockdown's done really well with him. He just came up short on the day. I don't think generally this will be form that we see replicated in Group 1s towards the end of the season around Europe. Quick Susie bypassed this to go for the Mornay, so it'll be interesting to see how that race unfolds. So, an eclectic week, nice mix, 4 races from Ireland, 2 domestic races for you. That was the verdict for the first week in August.